Welcome to another edition of the Camel Clutch Blog Extra, where we go deeper, take a more in-depth look at one of the more popular blogs on the website here on the podcast. And it is a real pleasure today to be joined by a gentleman who's been contributing to the website for well over a year now. He is the writer of the WWE Wrestler of the Week and has pretty much taken over as the pay-per-view preview and prediction guy for the WWE on the CCB, and that is Seth Gutenplan. Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's a pleasure to do this with you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Really looking forward to it. Always a fan of your writings, and I know you've been doing podcasting of your own for quite some time, so I'm excited to do this with you.
Absolutely. Same here.
Excellent. All right, so let's get right into it. I put together a top 10 list of best WWE comebacks. And as part of the criteria, what I did, and this shortened the list anyway, was I kept it to a year. So for anybody to be on this list, they had to have left for a full year or been out of the picture for a full year, because right away I had people coming to me and saying Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, but these are guys that left for a long amount of time, but not quite a year. So what I did was I tried to keep it, well, I did. I kept it to guys that left for a year minimum. And my criteria for putting people on the list was somebody that came back and came back bigger, or maybe came back and made just as much of an impact as when they left, but somebody that came back and didn't necessarily achieve the same level of greatness that they had when they were previously in the company. They didn't make the list. Maybe top 15, top 20, but not top 10. So, Seth, let's kick it off here. My first choice at the top of the list was Bruno Sammartino. And I might be a little partial because I've interviewed Bruno about a dozen times, and I've got to be a friend of his over the years. So it may be a little partial on my part, but I think when you look at best comebacks in WWE history, you got to put this guy right at the top of the list, because he was in the WWE in 1961, well before our time as wrestling fans and our time on this planet. And he had a falling out with Vince McMahon Sr. and Toots Mondt. He talked about it on my radio show a couple of times. He felt he wasn't getting paid what he was worth, so he left, and they actually blackballed him. They played a lot of games with him. They went to commissions and made sure that Bruno didn't get licensed and he wasn't able to wrestle in that particular part of the country or that particular part of the world if they had that kind of clout. And eventually cooler heads prevailed. They needed, Vince and Toots needed to do something for business. Buddy Rogers was on the way out, and they brought Bruno back, and then Bruno went on to a 7-year title reign. And not only was he a 7-year champion, I mean, the man just became an immediate part of popular culture. I mean, you talk to people that grew up in that era, they all know who Bruno Sammartino is. They all love Bruno Sammartino. Seth, when I looked at the list and I put it down on paper, I started with about 20. I just couldn't think of anybody else who had a better comeback than Bruno Sammartino.
Yeah, like you said, he's a little bit before our time, and you are definitely someone who, like you said, is friends with him and knows a lot more about his career than I do. But you can't ignore the fact that when he came back, he had that illustrious run as the longest reigning champion of all time, and obviously last year with CM Punk's reign going as long as it did, it brought back memories for people of Bruno Sammartino, and look what ended up happening with him entering the Hall of Fame. So you can't talk about comebacks without talking about the longest reigning champion of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. I put the list out and I've gotten some feedback, and I haven't had anybody argue with it. And yeah, it's one of those things with Bruno where you didn't watch him, I didn't watch him growing up. I mean, again, before I watched him a little bit. He was on the way out when I started watching wrestling, but not, of course, during his peak. But yeah, I've been fortunate enough to learn a lot about him just in talking to him, and I guess just becoming fascinated at that point. And what's cool now, as we're recording this, Bruno's back in the fold, and fans who who didn't get a chance to experience Bruno and watch him will now be able to relive his glory days with DVDs and that kind of thing. But yeah, Seth, when you look at it on paper, I don't think there's anybody else that's number one above Bruno.
I have to agree with you.
Great. All right, let's move on to number 2. And if there was anybody on this list that was going to give Bruno a run for the money, to me, it was Hulk Hogan. And it was Hulk Hogan's return in 1983. I mean, you want to talk about a comeback, at least when Bruno, I think Hogan might have even had a better place in the cards when he left as, back in the 80s, in the early 80s, than Bruno. And again, that's all, up to somebody that was watching during that time. So I can't confirm that. But Hogan left. And when he left, he was feuding with Andre the Giant, but he was losing to Andre the Giant all over the country. He had some matches with Bob Backlund here in Philadelphia. They headlined the Spectrum, and Backlund beat him here at the Spectrum. And Hogan was gone, and he left, and he went on to do Rocky III and rebuild his career in the AWA and New Japan. And then Hogan comes back and takes the pro wrestling world by storm. I was watching wrestling at that time, and I remember sitting in front of my television set and seeing him coming out to rescue Bob Backlund, who I believe was getting double teamed by Tiger Chung Lee and maybe Samoan Samu. I'm not really sure, but I vaguely recall Tiger Chung Lee in the mix, and I could be completely wrong on that one as well. But Hogan comes back, revolutionizes the wrestling industry, kind of the same way that Bruno did, where he revolutionized the wrestling industry in his own way at that particular time. And of course, Hogan has gone on, and there'll be many that could argue this, Seth, but I think he's gone on to become the most recognizable professional wrestler in wrestling history. I mean, his place in history is what it is, like him or not. And next to Bruno, I can't think of anybody else that achieved more the second time around than Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, I was born in '84, so I didn't know Hogan before he left. All I know is about what I've read and seen videos of, but you can't deny the fact that beforehand, I think they called him he had a different nickname. I don't think he was Hulk Hogan, right?
I think it was the Incredible Hulk Hogan.
The Incredible Hulk Hogan. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew he had some sort of nickname that was dropped when he came back. But when I started watching, that was the height of Hulkamania in the late '80s, early '90s, and like you said, he is definitely the most recognizable pro wrestler of all time. I think way ahead of Bruno Sammartino. I think the people who were watching wrestling in the '60s know Bruno, but Hogan from the '80s till now, he's done so much, and it started with the Hulkamania in the '80s.
Yeah, and I mean, as somebody that grew up during that time period, I could tell you, Seth, I started going to the Spectrum to see live WWF wrestling during the Bob Backlund era, about a year before Hogan came in, and I was there immediately when Hogan came in. I was there for his first title defense, and I wound up begging my parents to take me every month that he was here after that. So I was there during that time period, and I mean, it was just so different, and it's kind of hard to explain. I guess maybe the only comparison would be to somebody that was going to WWE shows a year before Stone Cold Steve Austin broke through, and then all of a sudden you're going a year later and you're in the middle of the Attitude Era and Austin breaking through. And that's the same thing here. I mean, the shows were exciting and they were very hot, but when Hogan broke through, I mean, it was just something else. I mean, it was just electric, I mean, the announcers say that, and it's very cliche, but it really was electric. When he was, have you ever seen Hogan live? I mean, I know you were a youngster then, but later on as a fan?
Oh, sure. I mean, I went to shows of the early to mid '90s. Well, I guess, what year did he go to WCW? 93, 94? I
think it was 90, 93, 94, somewhere around there. Yeah.
So I was already going to shows, and there's nothing like seeing Hulk Hogan live.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so Let's move next on the list. And here we get into the list where there's, I wouldn't say this is in any particular order, just guys thrown out there. And then here's a name that a lot of people listening to this podcast would probably be able to relate to, because this is a guy that they actually watched. This wasn't, 1984, 1963. We're talking about 2007. And when Chris Jericho came back to the WWE. Now, Jericho, of course, had some great success during his first go-around, because he was the first ever unified champion, but at the same time, he was more or less a transition champion for Triple H, and I felt that Jericho never really reached his full potential the first time around. And the second time around, he struggled a bit early on. He came in and had that feud with Randy Orton, and then he did that deal with JBL, and he just wasn't clicking the way that they were hoping that he would. And then all of a sudden, once he started with that subtle heel turn and then heel turn with Shawn Michaels, I think, for me, his feud with Shawn Michaels back during that time period, maybe the best of the modern era. I don't know how long you want to go back when you consider the modern era, but certainly one of the greatest feuds in the history of the WWE. And of course, he won the World Championship, and he completely reinvented himself. He changed his gimmick. He started coming out with suits. He was delivering promos more like Nick Bockwinkel as opposed to the wild Chris Jericho of the first go around. And when you think of guys that really had a whole second career, like a rebirth, just reaching a whole new level in their career, I don't think there's many that you can think about without looking past Chris Jericho in 2007.
Well, I have some thoughts about this particular pick of yours. Was this when Orton punted CM Punk, and then Jericho took his place and won the championship? Is this when Jericho won the championship that way?
No, I'm going back further. I'm going back to when...
That was 2009 then, right?
Yeah, I'm going back to when John Cena got hurt. I think he tore his pec, and he was in the middle of the feud with Randy Orton, and Cena was out, and then he made that return at the Royal Rumble the next year, but then Jericho came in and kind of took his spot at that point.
Okay. You see, this is definitely when Chris Jericho, as you said, made that good heel turn, and he started wearing the suits, as you said. I think this might have been the first time he had the shortened haircut. Mm-hmm. And, he had a good run, but it's hard to say if his run after this was better than his run before, because I not just being undisputed champion, but even from the very start, from when he made his debut, interrupting The Rock and with the whole Y2J thing, he really accomplished a lot in that first run. So I think it's hard to say whether or not, post 2000, from 2000 to 2009 was better than his run beforehand.
That's a fair point. That's definitely a fair point, and he certainly had a lot of peaks during that run early on, from '99 to I don't know when he left, 2004, 2005, 2000. I'm not really sure of when he left off the top of my head, but I don't know. It's definitely, you can definitely argue that point, especially when you look back on that resume and he was undisputed world champion at that time. I certainly can respect that viewpoint, but I don't feel that he ever really reached his full potential in the ring during that time, and there were a lot of politics being played at that time, a lot of guys trying to hold him back. And I think during this run here, and really I credit it to the entire Shawn Michaels feud, really, he just, I guess you could say, I feel like he cemented his legacy during that time.
Yeah, I think that was probably his best run as a heel in the WWE.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And speaking of Shawn Michaels, let's go next on the list to Shawn Michaels. Now, Shawn Michaels came back in 2002, and it's hard to say whether this comeback was better than his original run, because he was so decorated that during that original run, the comeback, he only won the championship one time, and it was for a very brief amount of time when he first came back. But when you look at the body of work from 2002 until the time that he retired against The Undertaker, and you could definitely argue this, because he had some classic matches, the two ladder matches, the Iron Man match with Bret Hart. But I just think that he had, I just think his body of work in the ring was just so incredible, and just even that much better than the body of work that he had earlier in his career. And I think a lot of that too was the attitude. I mean, you listen to interviews with Shawn now, and he was cocky and he was arrogant during that first run, and sure, he'd like to go out there and steal the show, but he wasn't necessarily as cooperative inside the ring, as far as helping get guys over as he was during the second go around. I mean, I remember a match that he had on Raw with Mark Henry, and Mark Henry wasn't exactly knocking it out of the park at that time. That was phenomenal. And it's just amazing when you look back, because Michaels, his back was busted, he was retired, he was out of the business, and he comes back at that SummerSlam, doesn't miss a step, and just has this amazing run during that time period.
Yeah, I have to agree with these points that you're making specifically, because like you said, I do think he accomplished more in his first run, but at the same time, coming back from such a serious injury and after 4 years was very impressive to then go another 8 years,
Yeah.
At the top of his game. And I think it was probably during that time that he was off that he became the born again Christian. Is that right?
Yep.
So I have to agree with another point that you were making, in that his attitude was different, and I credit it to that, to the becoming a born again Christian, and his views on things. I feel like he got in trouble early on in his WWE career, and he was fooling around, not getting along with a lot of people backstage early on, but him and Triple H, both of them, during this 2002 to 2010 time period, really both changed backstage a lot, not just in the ring. But like I said, he put on some great matches in that second run, but it's hard to say whether or not it was better than his first run. It was just different.
Yeah, absolutely. Next on the list is Sergeant Slaughter, and Sergeant Slaughter is a guy, I could talk a whole lot about. I'm sure you can too, because you were watching wrestling during that time period where he won the WWE Championship. I remember Sergeant Slaughter when I first started watching wrestling. And when I first started watching wrestling, I would read about him in magazines, and I would read stories about him and Backlund. At that time, I really didn't get the show too often, and he had that first go around. I think it was like in '81 with Backlund for the WWF Championship. They didn't win it, obviously. Then he had that second go around, which I watched every week, when he came out and beat up Bob Backlund during the Harvard Step Test. And I went to one of their matches at the Spectrum, which was a Texas Death Match, which was just awesome. It was just great. And of course, all those crazy Iron Sheik matches he had. So then he leaves, and he becomes somewhat of a cartoonish character with the G.I. Joe, and he was in the AWA, and he really wasn't doing a whole lot in the AWA. And then he comes back with this heel persona that's just so far to the left of what he was doing before. He's aligning himself with Iraq at just a time where tensions were high in America, and he beats the Ultimate Warrior for the World Heavyweight Championship. And when you talk about comebacks, his run on top was pretty short compared to a lot of these other guys that we're talking about. Even Jericho's run was a lot longer during his comebacks than Slaughter's was. But, from a guy that came from coming close a couple of times to winning the championship and headlining those matches with Backlund, to finally breaking through and not only beating the Ultimate Warrior for the World Heavyweight Championship, but then headlining a WrestleMania with Hulk Hogan. In terms of comebacks, I think it's a great one.
Yeah, well, during this time was actually when I started watching wrestling, was during this thing where he was with the evil Saddam Hussein of Iraq.
Yes.
That was really when I started watching wrestling, so I don't know too much about his first run, but I will say that it wasn't just a little bit impressive that he ended the reign of Warrior, but Warrior had just beaten Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania before. So to then go with the guy who just beat Hulk Hogan is very impressive, though I think he would end up losing it to Hogan the following WrestleMania. But, they did a great job of capitalizing on that heel character. I mean, how much better could you have written a story for a heel than to align him with that kind of character and that whole story? So it was just overall the story and character and development was very good.
Yeah, yeah, and especially a guy that when he left, I mean, he was right up there with Hogan as far as popularity goes. I mean, I remember I saw him and the Iron Sheik at the Nassau Coliseum, and I mean, just the place went absolutely bonkers for Slaughter. And here in Philly, he was here. They only came here once, which was really bizarre. But he came here once. It was him and Junkyard Dog against Sheik and Volkov, and the place just went nuts. I remember those guys coming out to bat to the bone. But yeah, coming from, just such a beloved patriot, that was his gimmick at the time, and coming back and just aligning with Iraq and, in the middle of the war, just great stuff. Really was. And his promos were great too back then. Not only that, he's actually, and we didn't even bring this up, Seth, he's actually aligned with the Iron Sheik during this time, his bitter enemy.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. All right, so let's go to 1987 and the return of the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. And what a lot of people might not realize is that Ted DiBiase was a WWF regular several years before that. Not only was he a regular, he was actually a champion in the WWF. He was the WWF North American champion, which didn't last long. The title didn't last long. But, you probably, when I say you, fans, have probably seen some of those matches years later, because I think there's a match with him and Hulk Hogan from Madison Square Garden. That's on one of the Hogan DVDs that came out. And I know they had their match on MSG Classics as well. So DiBiase was kind of just this journeyman, mid-Carter, and then he comes back with this great gimmick, like Slaughter, takes over as a top heel, sort of kind of won the championship when he bought it from Andre the Giant and had it stripped from him thanks to Jack Tunney. But from where he came just as a mid-Carter North American champion to main eventing with Hogan and Savage and becoming an icon, I mean, he really is one of the iconic wrestlers, one of the more iconic wrestlers of the time period. I think it was a hell of a comeback.
Yeah, well, you'll probably not be surprised, but I obviously didn't know Ted DiBiase well from his first run, because that was a few years before I started watching wrestling.
Me too. Yeah.
Okay. But I have seen those clips of him versus Hogan, and I don't even recognize him.
Yeah.
He looks so different. And when you have a gimmick like the $1 Million Man, we just saw him last week on Raw, the old school Raw. Mm-hmm. That's a gimmick that is going to last forever. Ted DiBiase Jr. tried to come in and do a little bit with it. I don't know if you saw the picture with JBL and Alberto Del Rio.
Yep.
That one of them posted talking about how it's the same gimmick, different generations of the same gimmick. It's everyone's going to remember the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. No one ever talks about his time before that, when, as you said, he was a journeyman. I didn't even know that character existed until I saw that clip with Hulk Hogan.
Yep. Yeah, way before my time, and I didn't realize it either. But I remember reading the magazines at the time, and he looked so different before he came in. And right before he came in here in Philly, we started to get the UWF where DiBiase was wrestling. So he had started to kind of morph. He lost some weight and dyed his hair blonde. So I started to see a little bit of it, but I mean, totally different character than the guy I grew up on watching in the magazines. That was a heel in Mid-South and Georgia and all those places.
Right.
Yep. So Jeff Hardy in 2006. Hardy left the WWE when he had problems with the wellness policy, or the wellness policy had problems with him, depending on how you look at it. Went to TNA, no-showed some pay-per-views, had some okay matches, and then just comes back out of the blue. And I don't think the WWE ever planned to put him in that headline spot. I don't think when they brought him back, they planned to put him there, but just little by little, just the fans just started to eat him up, and it was the fans that dictated, almost like Daniel Bryan in a sense, where the WWE never really had intentions of pushing Bryan that hard, but just the fans started with the yeses, and the fans just started to get behind Jeff Hardy, and then all of a sudden he's in main event matches with Randy Orton. He's the world champion. He's on WrestleMania in prime spots. I think it was a hell of a comeback by Hardy during that run.
Yeah, the one thing I remember from that comeback is if he hadn't left again, I guess to go back to TNA, I felt that run could have lasted so much longer.
Yeah.
He did achieve a lot in his first run. I mean, he and Matt Hardy were enhancement talent when they first entered WWE. I think you can probably find those kinds of episodes of Velocity and whatever with them as jobbers.
Sure.
Or even before that, Superstars. But he did show a lot good work the first run. I remember obviously the match with the Undertaker. A lot of people still talk about. And he won a lot of mid-card titles, tag team titles, obviously with his brother. But it was in 2006 that like you said, he got that push for the world title, and I do think that if he hadn't left on his own, he could have been champion for a lot longer.
Yep, me too. And I still think if he were to come back whenever his TNA contract is up, I think he would jump right back into that main event mix if he was to come back at some point.
He's just a very likable character, even though he's gotten into so much trouble and had so many personal issues. He's just his talent is just so amazing that fans just can't help but love him.
Yep. So let's go to 2011, not too long ago, and talk about The Rock. And this one, I can certainly understand if people want to argue with this pick here, because did he accomplish more than his first go around? Absolutely not. He certainly did not, and I'll be the first to admit it. But I just thought it was a hell of a comeback. I mean, he came in there, and when he came back, he didn't miss a beat. He headlined 2 WrestleManias against John Cena. He won the championship late in his career, and on top of that, I think what's most impressive is you look at what he did from a business standpoint. I mean, he jacked up those ratings every time he walked out there. I mean, there are very few guys you can look at that make that big of an impact on the ratings week by week, and Rock was one of them. And what was even more impressive is that Rock drew the biggest WrestleMania buy rate in company history with John Cena. That's huge. I mean, we're talking about 20. Well, at the time, what was it? WrestleMania 28. There were 27 previous WrestleManias, and they topped that, and it wasn't because of John Cena, it was because of The Rock. And I could certainly understand if somebody says, well, he didn't come close to achieving what he did the first go around. I get it, but when I'm sitting here looking at great comebacks, I just thought his comeback was fantastic in 2011.
Well, I am going to argue that his first run was so much better, and if it weren't for that first run, he wouldn't be who he is in 2011. He left to make the movies, but the whole Rock character developed in the late 90s, early 2000s. So the only part that I will agree with you is from the business standpoint, is that the name, his name and John Cena's name together, they're 2 of the biggest WWE superstars of all time in terms of their name and popularity. So in that regard, I'm not surprised that the buy rate was so high, but to me, he was a very big disappointment in 2011. His body, he doesn't look good. He looks too big.
I agree.
And his matches with CM Punk were not good.
I agree with that too. Now you're talking me out of my own pick.
And even the WrestleMania 28 match with John Cena, I was there and I could see them talking to each other, calling spots. It was a mess. Yeah. So I really did not enjoy his run. I found his promos and the Rock concert stuff to be very entertaining, but his matches I found were terrible.
Mm.
So I loved The Rock growing up. I when I was in high school, I did like a student council promo for people to vote for me and pretended to be The Rock and did my whole Rock promo. You know,
Awesome.
he was the man, in the late 90s, early 2000s. But 2011, he was a huge disappointment to me. And so I would not call that a good comeback.
All right. All right. So let's move on to 1984 and Jesse the Body Ventura. And this one is a little different because it's not like Ventura came back and won world championships and headlined all these pay-per-views or drew these sellouts in Madison Square Garden. But, what he did do was he came back and he became an icon. He became a pop culture icon. He's one of those guys from that era that just about everybody knows. If you watch wrestling during that era, you're bound to have quoted him at some point. When he was around the first time, he had a feud with Bob Backlund, and he was just about to start feuding with Hulk Hogan. I can't imagine that he was going to pin Hogan anywhere. He was probably going to wind up doing a couple of jobs to Hogan, and probably would have wound up back in the middle of the card feuding with Ivan Putski or Tony Atlas. And here Jesse goes on and just becomes this larger than life personality on color commentary.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know Jesse Ventura as a wrestler. I only know him as the color commentator.
Interesting.
I can just picture him with, his attire was always very interesting to me. It was always stood out to me. He had very interesting hats with the feather. So I really didn't know him as a wrestler, but he definitely became very well known to me as a color commentator, and obviously people know him now because he was the governor of
Yep.
Minnesota. So to me, he's known as a color commentator, and no one talks about his time as a wrestler.
Yep. And finally, on the list is Hulk Hogan from 2002, his return in 2002. And, this is a guy that I didn't originally put on the list. When I put the list together for the first time, I didn't have him on the list. And then I just kept going over the list, and I'm like, there's nobody here in this top, 11, 12, 13 that had as much impact when they came back as Hogan did. I mean, Hogan had that classic with The Rock in his prime. Hogan did some good things. He won the championship during that run. Now, obviously, I'll be the first to admit that he didn't come anywhere close to achieving what he had achieved during his previous run. But I thought it was a hell of a comeback for a guy at his age. It's a totally different style of wrestling. It's a totally different era of wrestling. But yet, not only was he still over, the guy was out there stealing the show at points.
Yeah, I have to actually agree with your reasoning here. I actually did take a break in watching wrestling in these 2002, 2003 time period. But I have to agree that yes, it probably wasn't as impressive as his run in the 90s. But the fact that he was able to come back and do the things that he did, that was impressive. So, like you said, he was able to stick with the Attitude guys, stick with guys like Triple H, Austin Rock. He was able to still be Hulk Hogan the way people remembered him, despite the years away.
Yep, absolutely. Well, that's my list right there. Who didn't make the list that you thought belonged on the list? Obviously, you wouldn't have put The Rock on the list, so there's a spot right there open for you to put somebody. So who else would you have put on the list?
All right, I have 4 people here. I'm going to start with the one that I know you're going to disagree with, and that's Christian in 2009.
Oh, okay.
Because Christian, he was just a mid-card, light heavyweight tag team guy. In his first run WWE, he left and became a main event guy in TNA. Comes back in 2009, he's ECW champion, and maybe it was because Edge had to retire, but he did finally get that World Heavyweight Championship and have a very impressive feud with Randy Orton.
Yeah, no, when you said Christian, I thought to myself, nah, it doesn't work. But when you break it down like that, he did. He finally got that big singles push that I mean, at least for me, somebody like me wanted to see him get during that end of that first run when he split from Edge, and it looked like he was going to go places. And I think he did that tease of that feud with John Cena when he would start rapping about Cena, but yet they wrestled, I think, like once or twice, but I think that it could have been much bigger than what they did. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would put it over The Rock, but I could certainly see your point. I really do. And when you, like I said, when you first said his name, I thought to myself, no way. But then you made a good case for him. You really did.
Thank you.
Yes.
Next, I have Bob Backlund, because he had a really obviously monumental run. I guess it was in the 80s, maybe even before that. But when he came back 92 to 94, he like you said with Hulk Hogan in 2002, even though he was in a different era, he still made it work with Bret Hart in 94 becoming WWF champion. The character that he became, that heel character, is the character we've seen most recently from Bob Backlund at the Hall of Fame, and from time to time if he shows up, he's this crazy Bob Backlund.
Right.
Bob Backlund from 1994.
Yeah. It's funny because I actually debated this with a couple of people on Facebook and through email and things like that, because they put Backlund on the list. And I'm actually gonna use your logic with The Rock as to why I wouldn't put Backlund on the list. And I'm probably the wrong guy, because I have a special place in my heart for Backlund, because Backlund was the champion when I first started watching wrestling. So I probably like him a lot more than most people listening to this webcast or this podcast, because I loved Backlund growing up. And even to this day, I could go on YouTube and watch old Backlund matches from his championship reign against Morocco and Patera and Valentine, and sit here and enjoy it just as much as I could watch, Michaels and Jericho. And for me, I thought Backlund's matches were terrible during this time compared to, again, like The Rock, compared to what I saw growing up. I mean, I didn't like the character. I felt it was limiting. I felt like his matches weren't anywhere nearly as good as they were from what I watched growing up. And yeah, he won the championship, but we had it for 5 years, I think it was, growing up, and then he lost it, in like 30 seconds to Diesel. I certainly, if this was a top 15 list, he would definitely be on it for me. But for me, using your same logic with The Rock, I didn't put him on there.
Yeah, it's understandable. I think some of these guys, some of these people on my list, probably have that similar argument as to maybe their first run was just so impressive that it was hard to match up to it. And maybe if I had seen Bob Backlund during that time, maybe I would have felt differently.
Sure.
But my next pick was the Legion of Doom. I recently watched their documentary on Netflix, and it was very interesting. And, in 1997, they came back. They had been going back and forth, I guess, between WWE, WCW, after their time in AWA and those and the NWA.
Yeah.
But, they had... They did the whole thing with Demolition in their first run, and the Hart Foundation, and obviously proved to be the best tag team. I think this DVD actually made me feel that they are the best tag team of all time in wrestling. They've accomplished gold in all the different promotions. But even in 1997, again, they were able to be there with the new attitude. They had Sonny with them now. They introduced draws to us, and they even were able to take Mike Hegstrand's personal life situation, and he was able to put it on screen. Animal talked in the DVD about how it might have been a little too close to home. But Hawk did it, and that was the Attitude Era, and so he was able to do it. And so, to me, these guys, maybe their first run was equal to this run.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I never would have even thought of that. But you know what? You make some great points, because their first run in the WWEF was good, but I think when you look back, some of the matches they had during that second run were even better. I think they were almost more cartoonish during that first run against the Natural Disasters and those Nasty Boy matches. So they were a little more cartoonish where, when they came back, they were a little more serious and they had some better matches. No, you know what? I can't disagree with that pick.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have one more, and I know it's going to be one of those, this person, you can't capitalize on their first run, but again, they brought an attitude. They were able to match up with the new era, and that's the Fabulous Moolah.
Interesting.
She's obviously historically one of the best female wrestlers of all time. There's no denying that, but she came back in 1999 and won the women's championship. Now, at this time, the women's championship was, bra and panties matches and, mud wrestling, whatnot. But at her age, to be able to do that was impressive to me. And she and Mae Young stuck around for a little while during the Attitude Era. Yeah,
Mae Young took the power bomb from Bubba through the table.
Exactly. So Fabulous Moolah definitely had, probably a more memorable, historic run at first, but people who are like my age who didn't grow up watching Fabulous Moolah are going to remember Moolah and Mae Young from the Attitude Era.
Awesome. I never would have even thought of her, but yeah. So those are our picks. As we wrap this up, anybody off the top of your head outside of the WWE that had one big comeback that really impressed you, that if I opened up this list to comebacks anywhere, you would have put on it?
I'm just starting to think about it now, when the first person that comes to mind is Scott Steiner.
Yeah.
When he became Big Papa Pump, he became a much bigger deal. I mean, he was a big deal as a tag team wrestler. With his brother, but he really took off as a single star when he became Big Papa Pump.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And he left. He went to the WWE for a little while, and they did Japan and ECW, and he came back and had that big run as Big Papa Pump. So yeah, definitely qualifies for a comeback. Well, Seth, take as much time as you need, but plug away. This was great. Really enjoyed having you on there. So where can the listeners of the podcast see or read more of you?
Well, I just want to mention one other person if you're going to open it up, and that's Kevin Nash.
Yes.
Because, he was Oz and all these random people at first in WCW, and then after Diesel became Kevin Nash in the NWO.
Yeah, and he comes back and totally dominates. Another guy I thought of was Sid Vicious. I kind of Psycho Sid. I went back and forth on it as well. We're talking WWE now. Sid won the title that first go around, against Shawn Michaels, but then he came back and he won the title again, and he was right in the mix with Bret Hart and Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels and Undertaker during that time period. It's just a guy that kind of popped into my mind as I was wrapping up the list.
Yeah, I didn't even think of Sid. That was a good one.
Yeah.
In any case, I have my own blog, gutwrenchpowerblog.com, GUTT, wrenchpowerblog.com. I've actually been posting not just wrestling, but NBA, basketball, movies, TV stuff on there too. Obviously, everyone should check out Camel Clutch blog every Friday for my WWE Wrestler of the Week. I've also now been more regularly been writing for my friends over at ProWrestlingPowerhouse.com, which is where I used to do my weekly podcast. And you can follow me on Twitter at Seth Mikey, SETHMIKEY.
Yes. Well, you know what, Seth? It was a lot of fun and always a good time hashing these top 10 lists. And everybody's got their own favorites. But at the end of the day, it really is a lot of fun. And hopefully, you'll come back and we'll throw around another list or two.
I would love to, Eric. I had a great time. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and thanks for joining me again. This is the Camel Clutch Blog Extra Podcast. You can subscribe on iTunes on the links provided on the website, or just keep checking back the Camel Clutch blog. That's camelclutchblog.com for more podcasts or some archives. And thanks for joining us.